Here is the voiceover script for Storysphere. What if the wrong turn you took this morning was actually meant to happen? Arthur slammed his foot on the brake of his sleek black sedan before his brain even fully processed why. The vehicle came to a dead stop in the middle of a narrow, forgotten street in the heart of Chicago. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring through the windshield, his heart tightening in a way he hadn't felt in over 6 years. Behind a crumbling concrete pillar of the bypass, there was a makeshift shack constructed of soggy cardboard and scrap metal. It was a miserable, desperate sight, covered with pieces of grimy, oil-stained cloth, as if the bustling, windy city had simply decided to blink and forget this tiny, miserable corner existed. But it wasn't the shack that held Arthur's gaze captive. It was the girls. They were sitting on a rusted crate, their small frames looking swallowed by the shadows of the overpass. Earlier that Tuesday morning, Arthur had been his usual distracted self behind the wheel. He wore a dark, expensive wool suit. His silk tie was slightly loosened at the collar, and a cup of overpriced artisan coffee sat untouched in the cup holder. As he did every single day, he was following the familiar route toward his corporate headquarters in the Loop. However, the traffic on the main expressway had been chaotic, a symphony of angry horns and screeching brakes from every direction, and he was already running late for a board meeting that could determine the next 5 years of his company's future. Frustrated, he had taken a sharp left onto a street he almost never used. It was a narrow, forgotten alleyway of a road that seemed to have been swallowed by the urban decay of the industrial district. That was when everything changed. There, nestled between piles of rotting garbage bags and stacks of discarded shipping pallets, stood two identical little girls. They had messy, tangled blonde hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks, and their faces were streaked with the soot of the city. They wore tattered, stained dresses that were far too thin for the biting chill of a Chicago spring morning. Their eyes were enormous, wide, and haunting, staring at his luxury car without an ounce of understanding. Two identical souls, completely alone in a landscape of concrete and steel. The two girls didn't take their eyes off Arthur for a single second. It wasn't fear he saw in that gaze, though fear would have been easier to handle. It was hunger. He recognized that look with a sharpness that physically hurt. It was the hollow stare of someone who had grown accustomed to waiting for something that never arrived. Arthur stepped out of the car, his leather shoes clicking on the cracked pavement. He took one step, then another, his breath hitching in his throat. The girls didn't run away. They stood perfectly still, side by side, as if they had instinctively learned that staying together was their only form of security. Arthur reached them and knelt, disregarding the fact that the knees of his $1,000 trousers were pressing into the filth of the gutter. He looked directly into their eyes, trying to keep his expression soft. "Hello there," he said, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. "What are your names?" One of them gave a tiny, timid smile, the kind of smile that appears slowly, as if it's afraid of being too much or being snatched away. "Yeah," she started, but her voice died in her throat. The other girl finished for her, in the tiny, high-pitched voice of someone still learning the rhythm of speech. "Jade. She is Jade. I am Sarah." Arthur felt a sudden, crushing weight in his chest that he couldn't explain. He looked at the shack, then back at them, then at their dirty, bare feet and their thin little arms that were trembling slightly in the wind. Something was terribly, tragically wrong here. He looked around the desolate street. There were no adults in sight, no pedestrians, no shopkeepers, just the distant roar of the city above them. "Is your mommy inside?" he asked, his voice trembling just a fraction. Sarah pointed toward the cardboard structure with a tiny, dirt-smudged finger and shook her head slowly, indicating no. It was then that Arthur noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked into a crevice of the cardboard, right at a child's eye level. It had been placed there specifically to be found, as if a mother knew that someone, eventually, would have to stop on this forgotten street. He reached out and took the paper, his fingers shaking as he unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, the script of someone who had likely never spent much time in a classroom. Please take care of them. I couldn't hold on any longer. God will reward you. Now stay with Story's fear, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this story. The words were like a physical blow to Arthur's stomach. His world, which had been built on spreadsheets, luxury, and cold logic, felt like it was collapsing under the weight of those 3 sentences. He folded the note slowly and tucked it into his breast pocket, right against his heart. And the words, "I couldn't hold on any longer," burned in his mind. 3 simple words on a dirty piece of paper that weighed more than everything he had ever achieved. He looked at the girls again. They were still watching him. Sarah had let go of her sister's hand and taken one small, cautious step toward him, like a bird approaching a stranger. "Do you have any food, sir?" she asked, in a voice that barely formed the words. Arthur closed his eyes for a second, fighting back a wave of emotion. He was 32 years old, possessed more wealth than he knew how to spend, and lived in a mansion with 7 empty bedrooms. He had lived in that house alone for 6 years, ever since Margaret had passed away and taken the last spark of life with her. And here a 5-year-old child was begging for bread under a Chicago bypass. "Yes, I do," he replied, his voice coming out hoarse and thick. "Do you live inside that little house?" The 2 girls looked at each other with that silent, telepathic communication that only twins possess. Then Jade, the quieter one, gave a small nod and ducked inside the cardboard structure. Arthur followed her, and what he saw inside nearly stopped his heart. The space was smaller than it appeared from the outside, a cramped, dark hole where 2 people could barely stand. The floor was covered with damp, moldy cardboard. In the corner sat a single, stale crust of bread covered in dust. 2 thin pieces of frayed fabric served as blankets. And next to them was an old tin can with a melted stump of a candle. There was a plastic bag containing 2 changes of rags and a half-empty bottle of water. That was it. Nothing else. No pots, no plates, and certainly no toys. Arthur stood there, his head nearly touching the cardboard ceiling, and felt his throat tighten until he could barely breathe. He thought of his kitchen with its marble countertops, his refrigerator that he rarely opened, and his pantry full of food that expired because no one was there to eat it. "Mommy left this morning," Sarah whispered behind him, tugging on the hem of his suit jacket with her tiny fingers. "She said she'd be back, but she didn't come." Arthur stood in the center of the miserable shack, the silence of the industrial district pressing in on him. He realized in that moment that these girls hadn't just been left for an hour or 2. They were waiting for a ghost. The mother had vanished into the gray expanse of the city, driven to a point of despair that Arthur couldn't even fathom. How long had they been alone? 1 night? 2 days? He knelt again, this time inside the cramped space. "Jade, Sarah, my name is Arthur. Can I take care of you today?" He spoke the words without thinking about the legalities, the paperwork, or the headlines. He simply couldn't leave them here. Sarah didn't hesitate for a single second. "Yes," she said, reaching out her small, cold hand for him to hold. Arthur grasped it, feeling her thin fingers against his palm. Something inside him that had been frozen and empty for years, since the funeral, since the house became just a set of walls, suddenly cracked open. He pulled his phone from his pocket, canceled his entire morning of high-stakes meetings with a single text, and turned the device off. And he took a girl in each hand and led them toward the car. But what he didn't know yet was that the story of their mother held a secret that would only surface weeks later and change everything he thought he knew about sacrifice. The first thing Arthur did was stop at a local grocery store. The girls sat in the back of the sedan, huddled together. Jade stared out the window with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing the world from a clean leather seat for the first time. Sarah kept running her hand over the soft upholstery, as if she couldn't believe it was real. When Arthur returned to the car with bags of fresh bread, fruit, and snacks, Sarah sniffed the air and let out a gasp. "Is that bread?" she asked, her neck straining to see. "It's bread, milk, and fruit," Arthur replied. "And I got some cookies, too." The girls looked at each other, as if he had just announced he had found a chest of pirate gold. Arthur felt his eyes well up with tears, right there in the parking lot, though he turned away so they wouldn't see. On the drive toward his estate in the suburbs, the girls ate with a ferocity that was heartbreaking. They ate fast, leaving nothing behind, like people who were never certain if another meal would ever appear. Arthur remained silent, his mind racing. He thought about the note, the jagged handwriting, and how many nights these children had spent shivering in the dark. He felt a surge of cold anger, not at anyone in particular, but at a world that allowed children to become invisible in the shadows of skyscrapers. As the car pulled through the wrought iron gates of his mansion, Sarah pressed her nose against the glass. "Is this your house?" she asked, in a tiny, stunned voice. "It's as big as a castle." Jade let out a small, soft giggle, the very first sound of joy Arthur had heard from her. He parked the car, opened their doors, and then something happened that he hadn't expected. As soon as Jade stepped onto the perfectly manicured lawn, she stopped. She stared at the vibrant green grass, the blooming flower beds, and the stone fountain bubbling in the center of the driveway. Then, without a sound, she began to cry. Tears streamed down her face, though her expression remained almost unnervingly still. Arthur knelt in front of her, panic rising in his chest. "What is it, Jade? Does something hurt?" She shook her head and pointed toward the flowers. "Mommy loved flowers," she whispered. "She always said we would have flowers one day at our house. I miss Mommy." Sarah came up behind her and wrapped her arms around her sister's waist. They stood there, two small children clinging to each other in the garden of a man they didn't know, carrying a grief that shouldn't fit inside such small bodies. Arthur stood frozen. He hadn't cried since Margaret's funeral, having learned to bottle everything up, to swallow the pain and just keep moving. But standing there in his garden, watching those two girls among the blossoms, he felt his own walls finally begin to crumble. Inside the house, Mabel, his cook, who had been with him for 10 years, let out a gasp when she saw them. "Good heavens, Mr. Arthur," she exclaimed, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mabel, we need to get them bathed, find them clean clothes, and get them a proper meal. Can you help?" Mabel didn't ask a single question, and she immediately hurried to find towels and run a warm bath in the guest suite. Sarah stood under the stream of warm water for the first time in her life. She kept her eyes closed, her face turned up toward the shower head, her mouth open in wonder. "It's warm," she whispered to Jade, who was standing beside her. "Jade, the water is actually warm." Arthur was standing just outside the bathroom door, leaning against the hallway wall, and hearing those 3 words, "It's warm," shattered the last of his composure. It was such a basic human comfort, something he took for granted every single day. Yet to these girls, it was a miracle. After the bath, Mabel dressed them in soft, oversized shirts she had found in storage and sat them at the large kitchen table. Sarah took a piece of fresh bread with both hands and took a bite so large that Mabel couldn't help but chuckle. "Slow down, sweetheart," Mabel said gently. "There is plenty more where that came from." Jade looked up from her plate and caught Arthur's eye as he stood at the end of the table. She stared at him for a long moment, with the unsettling seriousness that children sometimes possess when they're trying to figure out if the world is finally safe. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "God bless you." Arthur couldn't find his voice to respond. He just nodded, his heart aching. However, while peace had settled inside the mansion, a storm was brewing outside. 2 days later, Arthur's phone rang. It was Eleanor, his mother. "Arthur," she began, her voice cold and sharp like a razor. "One of the house staff mentioned you brought 2 street children into your home. Tell me that isn't true." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's true, Mother. They are 2 little girls, no more than 5 years old. They were starving and alone. They needed help. Are you calling social services today?" Eleanor demanded. "No," Arthur said firmly. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. The kind of silence Arthur had grown up fearing. It was the quiet before the tempest. "Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea where those girls came from. You don't know their mother. You don't know their history. And you certainly don't know what kind of trouble you are inviting into this family. You brought 2 total strangers into a house that carries our family name." Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. I know they were hungry, Mother. I know they were alone under a bridge in the middle of a cold Chicago morning. For me, that is enough. Eleanor hung up without another word. Arthur stared at the screen, knowing this was only the beginning of a long battle. The next day, a long black limousine pulled into the driveway. Eleanor stepped out with her personal attorney in tow. Her white hair was perfectly coiffed, and she carried her designer handbag like a shield. She marched into the living room without waiting to be invited. Sarah and Jade were on the sofa, watching a cartoon that Mabel had turned on for them. When they saw the stern woman enter, they stopped laughing and huddled closer together. Eleanor looked at them as if she were inspecting a smudge on an otherwise perfect painting. "Are these the ones?" she asked, standing over them. Arthur stood by the girls, his hand resting protectively on the back of the sofa. "Yes, they are." Eleanor leaned down to look at Sarah. Sarah looked back, unblinking, with that direct, honest stare that hasn't yet learned to be intimidated by wealth. "Where did you come from, child?" Eleanor asked. "From a shack," Sarah replied naturally. "But now I live here." Eleanor straightened up and turned to Arthur, her face flushed with indignation. "Did you hear that? Now I live here. This child has already laid claim to your estate, Arthur. This is exactly what I feared." Arthur's voice rose, matching his mother's intensity. "Mother, stop it. They are children." Eleanor shook her head. "You are my son. You come from a family of tradition and reputation. You are not going to become the foster father of two runaways from the gutter. I will not allow our name to be dragged through the dirt." Jade was quiet, but Arthur saw her expression shift. Even at 5 years old, she understood that this woman didn't want them there. "Mother," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave my house." Eleanor turned bright red. "Are you throwing me out?" "Your own mother. I am asking you to leave politely, but I am asking," Arthur insisted. Eleanor pointed a trembling finger at him. "If you continue with this insanity, I will cut you off entirely. I will remove everything that is in your name. Your inheritance, your shares in the family firm, everything. You will be left with nothing but this house and those children. Is that what you want?" Arthur looked at the girls on the sofa. Sarah had reached out and grabbed Jade's hand. They both looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of freedom wash over him. "If that is how you want it, Mother, then so be it. But I am not abandoning these children." Eleanor stood frozen for a second, unable to believe he would choose two strangers over his fortune. Then she grabbed her bag and stormed out. The car sped away, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah climbed down from the sofa and walked over to Arthur, tugging on his trousers. "Is she mad, Artie?" she asked, using the nickname she had invented for him. He knelt down and pulled both girls into a hug. "No, she's not mad. She just doesn't understand." Jade looked at him with that heartbreakingly old soul in her eyes. "The grandma doesn't like us," she whispered. "I know," Arthur replied, "but I like you, and this is where you stay." Sarah gave him a bright smile and went back to the television. But Arthur knew the path ahead would be long, and that he still didn't know the full weight of the trauma these girls carried. In the weeks that followed, Arthur hired a top-tier adoption attorney named Rachel. She was a no-nonsense woman with short, cropped hair who didn't make promises she couldn't keep. "It's a steep climb, Arthur," she told him during their first meeting in his library. "You are a single man with no children and zero experience as a parent. The court will question everything: your lifestyle, your work hours, your emotional stability. And we have to find a biological mother. Until there is official confirmation of abandonment or termination of rights, the process is stalled." The mother. The note. Arthur spent many sleepless nights thinking about Mary. Who was she? What had pushed her to that breaking point? What does a woman have to endure to write a note like that and walk away from her children? Meanwhile, Mabel was the first to notice how the girls were changing. Jade began to speak more, blossoming like a flower that had been deprived of sun for too long. She was observant, watching everything before she offered her trust, but once she gave it fully. She loved to sit in Arthur's home office while he worked, drawing at a small table he had set up for her. "Do you ever get tired of drawing, Jade?" he asked one afternoon. "No," she replied seriously. "I draw so I don't forget." "Forget what?" She held up the paper. It was a drawing of a woman with long hair holding the hands of two small girls. "Mommy," she said simply. Arthur stared at the drawing for a long time. He thought of Margaret and how he had spent years trying to forget because remembering hurt too much. He realized this 5-year-old was braver than he was. Sarah was different, loud, curious, and constantly asking the names of everything she saw. She followed Mabel through the kitchen like a shadow, wanting to help with dinner and tasting every ingredient. But one afternoon, she accidentally knocked a glass of grape juice onto the white rug in the living room. She froze, turning pale with terror, her little body trembling as she waited for a blow that never came. Arthur walked over, saw the mess, and simply grabbed a towel. "It's okay, Sarah. It's just juice. We can clean it up." Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide. "I don't get hit," she whispered. Arthur felt a cold knot of fury in his stomach at what that question implied about their past. He had to take a deep breath before answering. "No, princess. In this house, we don't hit. Accidents happen." Sarah stayed quiet for a moment, then helped him scrub the rug. From that day on, she stopped being afraid to make noise. In the 3rd month, the social worker, Faith, came for her first official visit. She toured the mansion, taking meticulous notes, watching the girls play in the garden, and interviewing Mabel. At the end of the day, she sat down with Arthur. "They are thriving," Faith admitted. "That much is obvious, but I have to be honest with you. This case is being contested. An anonymous report was filed questioning your fitness to parent, alleging you have a financial motive or are using the children for a PR stunt." Arthur knew exactly where that report had come from. "My mother," he muttered. "Regardless of the source," Faith said, "the judge will want to hear from you directly. But before we move forward, there's something else. The police have found the mother." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Is she all right?" "She was found unconscious in a shelter downtown," Faith explained. "She had no ID, but a nurse recognized her from the flyers we circulated. She's at Cook County Hospital. She's stable, but very weak." Arthur felt a rush of conflicting emotions. If the mother was back, his chance at adoption might vanish. But he looked out the window and saw Jade watering the flowers with a tiny watering can. He knew what he had to do. They deserved to see her. The next day, Arthur walked into the hospital ward holding a twin in each hand. The room was sterile and smelled of antiseptic. In the corner bed sat a woman who looked far too young to have a face so hollowed by exhaustion. Her brown hair was matted, and her arms looked like sticks against the white sheets. When they entered, she was staring at the ceiling, but when she turned and saw the girls, she let out a broken sob. "Oh my God," she whispered. Sarah was the first to break free. "Mommy," she shrieked, the sound echoing down the hospital corridor. She threw herself onto the bed, burying her face in Mary's neck. Mary closed her eyes, clutching both girls to her with every ounce of strength she possessed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Mommy," Sarah whispered, "we waited for you." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I know, my baby," she rasped. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Jade climbed onto the bed more slowly, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. The 3 of them sat there in the silence of the hospital room, Mary crying without making a sound, the tears flowing down her cheeks in a steady stream. Arthur stood back, realizing this moment didn't belong to him. He felt a profound sense of respect for this woman, who had carried the world on her shoulders until she simply collapsed. After a long time, Mary looked up at Arthur. "You're the man who took them," she said. "I am," Arthur replied softly. Then she looked at her daughters, at their clean clothes, their healthy skin, their brushed hair. "They look so good," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "They are doing wonderfully," Arthur said. "And you're going to get better too." Over the next few days, Arthur visited the hospital frequently, sometimes with the girls and sometimes alone. He learned that Mary was 26 years old and had been on her own since she was 12, escaping a foster system that had failed her. She had raised the twins while living in shelters, under bridges, and working odd jobs for pennies. The note wasn't an act of abandonment. It was a final, desperate prayer from a woman who had run out of strength, but refused to let her children go down with her. "Why are you doing this?" Mary asked him one afternoon. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Arthur sat in the chair beside her bed. "Because your daughters looked at me with a level of trust one hadn't earned yet," he said. "I decided I wanted to earn it." Mary looked away, her voice trembling. "I am scared. I'm scared to leave here and have nowhere to go. I'm scared I'll fail them again." Arthur leaned forward. "You won't be alone this time, Mary. I promise." She looked at him with the skepticism of someone who had heard too many empty promises. "Why do you care so much, Arthur?" He took a moment to reflect, looking at his own hands before meeting her gaze. "Because I was dead inside for 6 years," he admitted. "I lost my wife, and I learned how to live without feeling anything. I turned down the wrong street that morning, found her daughters, and they woke me up." He paused, a lump forming in his throat. "I don't believe it was a coincidence, Mary. I believe I was sent down that street because I needed them as much as they needed me." Mary didn't say anything, but for the first time, she didn't look away. When she was finally discharged from the hospital, Arthur made her an offer. "I want you to come live at the mansion," he said. "Not out of charity, but because Jade and Sarah need their mother, and you need a safe place to rebuild your life." Mary stared at him, stunned. "People don't just do that." "I do," Arthur said. "And what do you expect in return?" she asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Absolutely nothing." Mary closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were shining. "Okay," she whispered, "but I want to help Mabel with the house." When they arrived at the estate, Sarah shouted the news to the trees. "Mommy is living with us now," she cheered. Jade walked up to Mary and squeezed her hand. "You won't go away again, right?" Mary knelt down, framing Jade's face with her hands. "Never again," she promised, her voice finally strong. Over the following months, the mansion transformed. It wasn't about the furniture or the decor, it was the sound. There was laughter in the hallways. There were the sounds of sisters playing tag. There was the smell of home-cooked meals that Mary and Mabel prepared together in the kitchen. Arthur would come home late from his new venture. He had started a small consulting firm from scratch, after Eleanor followed through on her threat to seize his inheritance. But he didn't care about the lost millions. He had found something worth more. And he would walk through the door, and Sarah would sprint down the hall yelling, "Artie's home!" Jade would follow, more composed, but with a bright smile, and Mary would be standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and a look of genuine warmth. "Have you eaten?" she would ask. "Sit down. I saved you some dinner." It was the small things, the simple daily rhythms of a family, that moved Arthur the most. He began to realize he was looking at Mary differently. He found himself staying in the kitchen longer than necessary, just to hear her laugh. He noticed the way she cared for the garden, and how she looked at him with a gratitude that was slowly turning into something deeper. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Arthur and Mary sat on the back porch. The Chicago skyline glowed in the distance, but the garden was peaceful. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this," Mary said, her voice soft in the twilight. "You don't have to," Arthur replied. "You do. You saved my girls. You gave me a life I thought was impossible for someone like me." Arthur looked at her, seeing the strength and beauty that had been hidden under layers of hardship. "You deserve this all along, Mary. Someone should have told you that a long time ago." A single tear trailed down her cheek. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "In the hospital, you said you were dead inside. Are you still?" Arthur looked out at the fountain, then back at her. "No," he said. "I'm not." He reached out and placed his hand over hers, and they sat in silence, watching the fireflies dance over the flowers. The day of the final court hearing arrived on a crisp Saturday in May. The courtroom smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Arthur sat in his best suit with Rachel, the attorney, by his side. Mabel sat in the back row, clutching a set of prayer beads. Mary sat on Arthur's other side, holding the hands of both girls. The judge, a stern but fair man, reviewed the files, asked several pointed questions, and listened to Faith's report. Then he turned to Mary. Ms. Miller, do you believe this arrangement is in the best interest of your children? Mary stood up, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, Arthur is the kindest man I have ever known. He saved my daughters when I couldn't, and he helped me save myself. If there is anyone in this world who deserves to be their father, it's him. Mabel began to sob quietly in the back of the room. The judge nodded and picked up his gavel. I hereby grant the petition for adoption. Jade and Sarah shall legally be the daughters of Arthur, with the full consent and continued participation of their biological mother, Mary. The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then it exploded. Mabel hugged Rachel, and Faith offered a rare, genuine smile. But it was Sarah who moved first. She climbed onto the chair next to Arthur and whispered directly into his ear, Daddy. Arthur closed his eyes, the word vibrating through his entire soul. Jade pulled on his other arm. Daddy, she repeated. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He pulled them both into his lap and wept. Not for the wife he had lost, but for the life he had found. 6 months later, in the garden where Jade had first cried over the flowers, Arthur knelt in front of Mary. The girls were standing nearby, Sarah jumping with excitement, and Jade smiling wider than Arthur had ever seen. You taught me that family isn't just something you are born into, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. It's something you choose every single day. For 6 years, I stopped choosing. I stopped feeling. It was your daughters who woke me up, and it was you who made me realize I could love again. I choose you, Mary. I choose this family. Will you marry me? Mary looked at her daughters, then at the man who had stopped his car on a street where no one else did. She remembered the note she had written in despair. She hadn't known then that the end of her rope was actually the beginning of a beautiful bridge. Yes, she whispered. Sarah let out a cheer that probably reached the neighbors, and Jade hugged them both. As they stood there in the sunlight, Arthur realized that his mother had been wrong. He hadn't lost anything by giving up his inheritance. He had gained the only thing that truly mattered. Outside the gates, the world was still a difficult place. There were still children in shacks and mothers at their breaking points. But Arthur had stopped. He had seen the invisible. And sometimes, one person stopping is enough to change the universe for 3 others. This is Storysphere, and this is the kind of story that reminds us what truly matters. Life is a series of intersections, and often the most significant moments of our existence are hidden behind the wrong turns we take on a Tuesday morning. As we grow older, we begin to understand that wealth is a fickle companion. It can build walls, but it cannot heat a home. It can buy a bed, but it cannot provide the peace required for sleep. For a man like Arthur, the true tragedy wasn't the loss of his wife or the threat of losing his fortune. It was the slow, silent calcification of his heart. We often mistake safety for living. We build fortresses of routine and silence to protect ourselves from further pain, forgetting that a heart that cannot feel sorrow is also a heart that can no longer feel joy. The 2 girls were not just children in need of a home. They were messengers, sent to remind a man that his purpose hadn't expired with his grief. There is a profound lesson in the desperation of Mary, the mother. In our society, we are quick to judge the shack and the note. We look at the external signs of failure and miss the internal triumph of a mother's love. To give up what you love most so that they might have a chance to survive is the ultimate, most agonizing form of sacrifice. It is a reminder that we never truly know the burdens others are carrying. That jagged note was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to a strength so great it chose the children's survival over her own pride. When we look at the world, we must learn to see beyond the grime and the soot. Humanity is often found in the places we have been taught to avoid. For those of us who have lived long lives, we know that the Eleanors of the world are many. There will always be voices telling us to protect our status, to guard our reputation, and to stay within the lines of tradition. But tradition that lacks compassion is merely a tomb. True legacy is not found in the shares of a company or the names on a building. It is found in the life you breathe into another person. Arthur's choice to lose his inheritance was not a sacrifice at all. It was a trade of cold metal for warm hearts. It reminds us that at the end of our journey, we will not be asked how much we accumulated, but how much we shared, especially with those who could offer us nothing in return. The story of the bridge and the garden serves as a beautiful metaphor for the human experience. We all start under a bridge at some point, cold, hungry, and waiting for a sign. And we all hope for a garden where the water is warm and the flowers are plenty. But the garden only exists because someone decided to stop their car. It only exists because someone was willing to get their expensive suit dirty in the mud of someone else's struggle. This is the true meaning of a life well lived. It is the realization that we are all interconnected and that our own healing is inextricably linked to the healing of others. When Arthur saved those girls, he didn't realize he was actually saving himself. May we all have the courage to turn down the wrong street when our hearts tell us to. May we have the eyes to see the children in the shadows, and the ears to hear the silent prayers of those who have run out of strength. Life is short, and its true beauty is found not in the grand achievements, but in the small, warm moments. It's warm of a bath, the daddy of a child, and the shared silence of a porch at twilight. Let's be people who stop. Let us be people who care. Because in the end, love is the only thing that remains when the skyscrapers have crumbled and the fortunes have faded away. Family is not just blood. It is a choice made in the wreckage of the world. A promise to stay when everyone else has walked away. And that, dear friends, is the greatest story any of us can ever write. Thank you for watching Storysphere. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because every soul deserves to hear it.